Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Ganit Ankori. I'm the Henry and Lois Foster Director and Chief Curator of the Rose Art Museum. And on behalf of the Rose team and our partners Beyond Conflict, I'm thrilled to welcome you to our program. Today's conversation, generously supported by the Wolfcon Foundation, is presented in conjunction with our current exhibition titled Peter Sachs' Resistance. The show presents 88 portraits of individuals from across the globe who have resisted various forms of oppression. The installation also includes an immersive soundscape, an audio collage comprised of the words of the resistors read out loud by towering contemporary figures linking the past with the present and inspiring the future. The show, a collective portrait of courage, is on view through December 30th, and we truly hope that you will have a chance to come to the museum and experience its poetry, power, and poignancy. So, celebrating Beyond Conflict's 30th anniversary, and inspired by the Rose Art Museum's vision to activate the power of art, ideas, and creative expression, collectively build a more just and equitable world. We present Resistance Times Beyond Conflict, a limited series bringing artists, activists, and leaders from across the globe together in dialogue to address the most pressing issues facing our rather troubled world today. Today's program is titled Change and Transformation. We ask how deeply entrenched and divided communities imagine a new way forward, build on just equity and reconciliation. Moderated by Beyond Conflict's founder and CEO, the amazing Phillips, this conversation will include South African-born artist Peter Sachs, activist and founder of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, Monica McWilliams, and Roelf Meyer, a key architect in the negotiations to end apartheid and rebuild South Africa. It is such a great honor to welcome our esteemed panelists and also our audience. I'm thrilled, Tim. I'm thrilled to hand it over to you, and I'm looking forward to learning from you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ganit. And I want to thank my colleagues at the Rose Art Museum at Brandeis. And certainly I want to thank Peter, Monica, and Roelf for joining us today. And I want to say just a couple of quick things before we get into a conversation. And one of them, obviously, is I want to thank everybody for joining us today. But I want to pick up on the theme that Ganit just described of change and transformation and a new way forward. So Peter's exhibition, which you haven't seen, you must go and see at the Rose Art Museum, Portraits of Resistance. And we'll have a conversation with Peter about what led him to think of these portraits and what shaped his experience growing up in South Africa under apartheid to think about resistance. But when we think about resistance, it's not only resisting oppression, it's resisting violence, it's resisting conflict, it's resisting, ways of thinking and systems that really reduce people's capacity to be individuals and communities and individuals as they see themselves. But what's on the other side of resistance? It's renewal. It's re-beginning, if there's such a phrase. And it's also reimagination. It's about where do we go from here? Because resistance is also taking us in a destination that we want it to be expansive and we want it to be transformative. And so one of the key things in Beyond Conflict's work over the last 3 decades is bringing together people across profound divides who never imagined change in their own situation, felt like there had to be a better way, there need to be a different way of dealing with the trouble, the conflict, or the system they were living under. And they found a way as individuals and colleagues to come together, but also to sit across the table from people who had been their enemy or adversary, or somebody they feared, or fundamentally didn't know. And they sought together to transform their societies. And so I'm so excited that two longtime friends, Monica McWilliams and Roelf Meyer, will be joining us today. And we're going to start with Monica. And one of the questions I want to ask Monica, and then we'll go to Roelf and then Peter, is, growing up in Northern Ireland at a period when the Troubles were really starting to emerge, you were both an activist, you were an educator. And could you just talk a little bit about what led you to actually step out of the academy or step out of your home to actually get engaged? And then how that led you into politics? And what have you learned in that process?
Hello to Boston and South Africa and Miami and all the other places from Belfast on a winter night. And thank you for the invitation to join you this evening. What led me? Well, I cut my political teeth in the civil rights movement, and it was watching the civil rights movement in the United States, and it eventually made its way across the Atlantic and hit us with a great big wave where we came out in our thousands and started marching. I was a teenager, and you're full of adrenaline when you're a teenager. And of course, we were facing CS gas and rubber bullets and eventually live bullets. But it was really, believe it or not, the connection with South Africa. We had an anti-apartheid movement starting here, and I was older by then, and the resistance came in emptying bags of oranges onto the supermarket counters. First, we would go and buy them or take them off the counter, and it was our form of protest against buying South African goods. We would bring them up to pay for them, and fortunately for us, the shopkeepers supported us, and they also emptied the oranges out of the baskets. They got sacked, and the trade union movement then supported them, and then we went out on picket lines. So it was that kind of trade union combination with community activism, combination with an international struggle that we could identify with, because we had our own form of apartheid here, nothing comparable to South Africa, but we had the Special Powers Act. We had a very, very difficult police at the time facing us, using strong powers. And so that comparison brought me out in terms of the resistance that we were facing was very repressive. And that taught me a lesson, that if the state doesn't sit up and listen and starts using very repressive means, it will deny people justice, and people in turn will deny it peace. And that's unfortunately what happened for the following 30 years. And eventually, believe it or not, Ralph, it was your talk through Tim in a hotel where I've just come from this afternoon, here in Belfast. You may remember it. Just after the ceasefires, Tim had the foresight to bring you and Cyril Ramaphosa. And I sat in the back of the hall that night, and I was the mother of two small children. And I had already worked for 25 years in the women's movement. I keep saying that I came from civil rights into women's rights and on to human rights. And you blew me away by what you and Cyril were saying. You said it's at moments of crisis that you pick up the phone and speak to each other. It's when things look really bad, and you were talking about your own transition. And we were in a moment of transition. We'd had the ceasefires, but we weren't sure if we could possibly get to peace talks and through that to an agreement. And I remember asking a question about leadership. And the usual complaint here was that we didn't have a Mandela. And your answer was, you grow your leaders. And I went home that night thinking, well, maybe I need to do something more than just be in civil society as an activist. And if they do declare peace talks, maybe we should call the women in the country together and see if we should form ourselves into a political coalition and demand and claim and get elected to a space at the table. So that's how it started. It wasn't, we didn't fall out of the sky, which is what the other politicians told us. Where did these women come from? We said we'd been around for 25 years, and it was through social movements and civil society.
Thank you, Monica. That was very powerful. And can I ask before we go to Roelf, and it's a wonderful transition. So you're in the negotiations that led to the Good Friday Agreement, which will be observed in April for 25 years. You probably came in with not only we need to be at the table, and we have been resisting the system that needed to change. but you were sitting across the table from people who represented maybe the worst elements of what you were trying to change. How did that feel personally and emotionally, and then play out politically when you're sitting across the table from people that you have profound, not just agreement with, but shared very different values and said and did some pretty horrible things? And how did that play out in terms of your role in the Women's Coalition, but in the relationship with these individuals?
Well, I think President Mandela is famous for that statement: you don't make peace with your friends, you make it with your enemies. And I had the privilege of hearing him say it directly when we were taken to South Africa, to a military camp there during the negotiations. But I was already aware of those kind of words and the need for dialogue, because we had been in a monologue and everyone was full of their own certainties. And I was unexpectedly elected through the Women's Coalition to the table, and we were the only women as we sat down that first day, and I was terrified. Because these were all big beasts that I was about to encounter, some for the very first time, but mostly in my nightmares. And I thought, how do I start working with these people? And one of the ways we did it was to invite some of them to our home, to find out what made them tick. Because a strength of negotiators is to find out where the others are coming from. But too many of our parties were taking pride in not speaking to each other, and taking the pride in saying, I will never speak to that group or to that party. And indeed, some of them never did. Even the day that we signed the agreement, they hadn't said good morning. But we took a different view, and it was not easy because my own boyfriend had been murdered in '74. And one of the groups was affiliated to the armed group that had murdered him. But that's what you do. So we also prepared him. Prepare, because you never know when that moment's coming. And we sat here where I'm speaking to you now from my kitchen table. And we came every night to this table and thought about the worst questions we could be asked the next day, or what's the worst thing that could happen to us. The difficulty of those negotiations were that they were in secret. You know, they were hidden from the public. And rightly so, because it would have been very difficult for people to say what their demands were going to be or what they might accommodate before we ever reached an agreement, in case they would be seen as traitors. And so the TV cameras weren't there. But we had to find a way of getting that message out. And that's where you came in fact, and helped us through that process and took us out of the country at one stage. Remember you taking us to Cambridge, and the methodology that you used there was where we got to talk about other people's conflicts rather than our own. And then we began to talk to each other through that. So sometimes you need to be taken away out of the place where the animosity is so great, the adversarial nature of the discussions is so hurtful, that you need to find a space and a place where you can reflect and find the humanity in the other. And I want to commend you after all these years for helping us to do that.
Well, thank you, Monica. It's really quite generous, and really appreciate it on behalf of my colleagues as well. And I want to go to Roelf next. So Roelf and Monica, you've known each other for a number of years, and it stemmed from that visit to Belfast in the early '90s. And Roelf, before we talk about what you describe as a paradigm shift in South Africa, I remember I invited you and Cyril to come to South Africa in 1993, '94, and this was the day of the fax machines before the internet. And I came into my office the next day, and I was very excited to get this fax from you as Minister of Constitutional Affairs saying you're coming. And then here we are 3 months later in Belfast at that hotel, Monica, the Europa. Remember, there was a dinner the night before, and I made sure I sat next to you, and I said, I have to ask you, why did you say yes? And you said, because nobody had ever invited you out of South Africa. You had just negotiated the end of apartheid. You're coming up to this election to share the experience with people struggling through change. You've had, you and Cyril had traveled to the United States and other places, I think, to get honorary degrees and talk in those settings. But in a country where they hadn't yet initiated a peace process, you both felt it was a moral obligation. And then you came to Belfast, you met Monica and others. And I remember one moment you said, wow, there's so much here that resonates with our experience back home. Could you maybe talk about that first?
Good.
You're on mute, Rolf.
My apologies. I first of all have to say congratulations, Tim. This is about the 30 years of Beyond Conflict that we're celebrating here. And it's wonderful to reunite in this way. Monica and Tim, like you have described, met each other as a three-person combination in this webinar for the first time in July of 1994. That moment in Belfast. I remember it so clearly. Thanks for your kind comment, Monica. But that was really an opportunity for us, because just 3 months before we saw the first democratic election in South Africa and the changeover to President Mandela. And that was the first moment where we could go out and share what we've been going through and tell others about it. I think it was not even in our minds at that time that we have a message to the rest of the world. It was just that we were so excited about our story to have the opportunity to share it. But going back to your question, Tim, I think the point is this, each of us can tell a story at the personal level of where we're coming from and what we've experienced. And I want to make 2 points about this. I personally come from an apartheid background. I grew up as a supporter of apartheid, like the vast majority of white South Africans at the time. Peter was probably one of the few exceptions, but the vast majority of white South Africans supported apartheid. And I grew up within that structure. I can even say that my generation were the beneficiaries of apartheid laws that were introduced in the 1950s and the early 1960s. So, when I went through school and even university, there was no good reason from a natural point of view to question apartheid, because I had a good life, so to speak. But more than that, this whole thing about racial segregation in South Africa, the whole paradigm that existed lasted for more than 300 years. And that is what we had eventually to break down and to replace it with a democratic system which we can be proud of. And I think one of the questions that one has to delve into and ask ourselves all the time, because it's applicable now in other cases around the world, and that is, how do you change those that are in power and feel the strength of their autocratic system like we had it in South Africa? We had an autocracy where the white minority was in power and felt that they had no reason to give up. How do you change that? Now, this is one of the moments that really helped me to think differently. I was already a politician. I was already a member of parliament of the white parliament as it existed in the early 1980s. And then I had the opportunity to make my first visit to the United States. And I shared this before with you, Tim, but that was a turning moment for me, like other moments as well. But this was a turning moment because I had the opportunity to choose my own theme for that visit. The United States Information Service invited me and they said, you choose what you want to focus on. And I said, I want to learn about what happened after the civil rights movement in the US. In other words, what happened in the 1960s when I was a young student really impacted my mindset at the time. And I was starting to wonder what was happening after. And then I had the opportunity to travel around the US. And this was 1982. And it had a major impact on my thinking. And I came away, and let me just anecdotally say one thing. I inter alia had a meeting with the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, at their headquarters in New York, and I was alone. So you can imagine how these guys attacked me in that conversation because I was representing the apartheid system. But it was for me an excellent experience, being exposed to those questions, being exposed also to the way in which the American democracy worked at that stage. And I came away and I came back to South Africa and I said to myself, that is what we have to create in our country. This is 1982. And so myself and many others started to work, went onto that path of changing South Africa and bring about a democratic state. Unfortunately, we succeeded in doing that. But the point is, and we can talk further about it, you have to, and I think Monica also reflected on that when she said she had to go home and decide for herself, what am I going to do about this? And I think that is one of the calls that we have tried to share with others in conflict situations around the world. You have to, as an individual, respond to that question. What can I do to make it a better situation? Let me stop there.
Well, thank you, Roelf. And I have a question before we go to you, Peter, and that is, you know, when I think of resistance, at least where I grew up thinking about resistance, it was always against a system, a group of people that one had to really radically change and address in some, you know, pretty important ways. And yet, the more we engage, what I found in my work around the world, watching you and Monica and many others, is when they finally engaged with their adversary, in many cases, the enemy, they realized they were also human. There were a lot of misperceptions. There was a lot of stereotypes, but there were also some profound differences. And what your story tells me is, even particularly as somebody who was in a key leadership position of apartheid state, that you, in a sense, were an ally working within the system to change it. And not just cut the best deal for the government, but really radically transition South Africa. And you've said, and you touched upon it a minute ago, that one of the most important things you came to realize is that your system that you were a part of and benefited was based on this concept of superiority versus inferiority. And when you were helping negotiate the new constitution in the early 90s, the point that we're all equal at that moment has become in many ways like, well, of course, that's what they achieved. But I tell people in this country, imagine George Wallace as governor of Alabama in 1962, sitting on the steps of the state capitol saying, we're all fundamentally equal, African Americans, whites, in this state, in this country. People would not believe it. And yet, it seems to me that one of the most important things we need to resist is our own binary thinking, to resist that there can't be true allies on the other side who are going through a process of resistance within those structures, systems, and parties. And can you maybe just speak about what that was like for you?
Yeah, I think it's, you know, it had to become an inner conviction. And that is why I keep on talking about paradigm shift, and the need for paradigm shift starts with yourself as an individual. And you know, when I started to look back at what really happened within my framework of thinking, within my direct personal experience, it became clear to me, and that was afterwards, it became clear to me that I went through a whole process of deep inner change from a paradigm that said we are superior, the white people of South Africa, we are superior and the rest are inferior, to realizing that is totally indefensible, unjust, and we couldn't go ahead with that. But what we needed to replace it with was a new paradigm. And fortunately, you know, I was in the very, very fortunate position to be part of that change that happened. And the change happened because of a breakdown in the negotiations. We were forced to go back to the drawing board and ask ourselves, what is it really that we want from the future? Instead of what is it that we want to protect from the past? The past was this paradigm of superiority versus inferiority. And how did we replace that going forward with a new vision? And once we decided jointly, us and the ANC and the other liberation movement representatives, that what we really wanted from the future is a state that respects individual rights on an equal basis for all. And once we had agreement on that, the old paradigm was gone. But it was my own, can I say, evolution that brought me to that understanding. And for that reason, I was able to play a role in bringing about this broader paradigm shift. If I was not able to live into this myself, to really accept the consequences of that change, I would not have been determined to make it work. And that is why I kept on using the comparison between paradigm shift and a pragmatic shift, by saying the pragmatic shift is one where you start to realize change is necessary, but you don't accept it yourself. It's necessary for others, but not for you as an individual. Whilst paradigm shift means it becomes part of your life. It's not only an intellectual exercise, but you also buy into it with your own soul. You put, so to speak, yourself online to make it happen. And it's that inner conviction enabled me to sit next to Cyril Ramaphosa, our current president, and find answers on a collective joint basis, mutual basis, to say, this is what we want from the future. And we were completely on the same playing field as far as that is. Sorry, I went on too long.
Not at all. I want to go back to Monica one more second, but Roelf, you've said in the past, by the way, this is a benefit of us having a long relationship and having conversations, but you've said in the past, when I once asked you and others in an audience said, how did you feel in the days leading up to the negotiation and how did you feel after? Could you just talk briefly about that?
Yeah, you know, I can try to say it in a very simple sentence. The day that we really came to the conclusion of our, let's say, political settlement, in other words, when we agreed on the change and what it would mean, was when we signed, or our leaders signed the interim constitution. That was in November of 1993. And the signing ceremony took a long time to finish off. It was late at night or early morning when it happened, when Mandela and de Klerk signed the interim constitution as part of this major deal. This final moment where we could say, now it's a handover from apartheid to democracy. And we started to celebrate, and we had a big party. And somewhere early hours of the morning, a journalist came to me, I think a bit tongue in the cheek, and said, why are you celebrating? You've just written off all your rights as white people, and you were leading this process. How can you celebrate? And my first and immediate response, because I thought it was a stupid question, but my immediate response was to say, I can celebrate because I've liberated myself. And that is exactly how I still feel today. In other words, the tension that led to that moment was replaced with one of relief, of the feeling of liberalization as an individual. And I could say it as a white South African, that I'm celebrating my own liberalization together with my fellow South Africans who are Black. And that was the dramatic moment of change. Now, we were very fortunate, you know, like Monica was also referring to earlier, that we had the leadership of Mandela and others that could make this possible. In other situations, it's not that easy. But, and that is the point Monica made, and that is, we can all be little Mandelas if we follow that example. We must just keep on studying what he said, and then we can fulfill that dream.
Thank you, Rolf. But before I go back to you, Monica, I'd like to go to you, Peter. As somebody also born in South Africa, but unlike Rolf's initial beginning, you were in opposition to apartheid. You were an activist and actually became very close and worked closely with Steve Biko. But that experience shaped you in pretty profound ways. You then left South Africa, as a lot of people had to who were opposing the system, and you came to the United States. You became a writer, and then you became a visual artist. And I would love to know from your experience how it shaped you as an artist when you think of resistance, and both then in terms of your activism and the work you do today.
Thank you, Tim. Am I audible?
Mhm.
Yes. Well, I also just want to begin by saluting Beyond Conflict on its 30th birthday and wish you many happy returns and salute the incredible amount of work that you've done around the world. And it was so beautiful to hear the intimacy with which Monica and Rolf were recalling your catalyzing introductions. So I'm honored to be here with Monica and Rolf, two great heroes. And I think my own background is different from Rolf's, although it's beautiful to see how different backgrounds do indeed come to converge, and in some ways with a kind of pulse that is, I don't know how to say it, but intensified by your sense of the other's journey to get there. And it's, so my background led me to have an almost visceral, instinctive feeling that there was injustice in the regime and that segregation made no human sense and was indeed criminal, the way in which it was being inflicted. So even as a child, that began to wear on me. And yet I think Rolf is correct to point out that all white people were beneficiaries. They were privileged. And so then it becomes an internal conflict. How do I reconcile my ability to walk around, go to a particular school that's segregated, live in an area that's segregated? How can that be compatible with my sense of what it is to be a decent human being? So that inner warfare did begin to move me in ways that led me actually to leave the country. And that's why I was very fascinated to hear Monica and Rolf refer to their times in the United States. But I first chose when I was 16, I had started medical school, but I'd said to my parents, I need to take a year away from this country and just get some perspective on who I am and what this political system is doing to us all. And so I went for 1 year as an exchange student, but I went to the city of Detroit, not of my choice. I was just sent there, and it happened to be the year 1967, 68. So an incredibly violent time of race riots. And I came across the huge contradiction for a 16, 17-year-old, very inexperienced person who had assumed all we need is one person, one vote, and you're going to get a solution. But I realized that democracy is still, that racism is a much harder thing to solve than sheer ballots. So I had a very rapid education, I think, in political complexity during that year. And then when I went back to South Africa is when I got involved in ways that were more active. After all, I was no longer a 16, 17-year-old. But at 18, did get involved in the National Union of South African Students, which was one of the few multiracial opposition groups. I was on a student representative council at that point at the University of Natal, and Steve Biko was a medical student there at that time. And we began joint activities, arranging protests, speaking out at, I remember significant occasions on which we would hold rallies and protest. The government was using, had suspended the rule of law, and they would round up people, put them in prison without trial, often just for interrogation, but often also just to get them out of the way. And would give speeches, give rallies, stand outside City Hall or in the streets. And I think what was formative for me, though very difficult, was the exact period during which the South African Students' Organization started to form itself along the principles of Black consciousness, which meant separating themselves from what had been a multiracial opposition group and establishing an independent organization. And I felt distressed by that, but it was Steve Biko who really was able to communicate to me. And here I want to say something about face-to-face, because being in the presence of another human being who moves you, who gets your emotions, who you can look into their eyes and get a feel for what they are feeling, got me to understand what their logic was or what their psychologic motives were. And so I had a lot to learn from him, in addition to just having an enormous affection and having shared friendships and shared mentors. Actually, Richard Turner, an extraordinary political science professor teaching there, who was subsequently assassinated the year after Steve Biko was killed. So that's 1977 and then 1978. But I think when I left the country, it was partly in a kind of demoralized state of not knowing exactly how the way forward was, given those circumstances, and seeing how that movement was seeming to split along racial lines. And I wasn't ready to go into the deep underground or, join the Communist Party or movements which had, in retrospect, a tremendous amount of integrity, extraordinary human beings involved in that struggle from outside, realizing that one needed a crowbar, not just a enlightenment. And so I think I came away in 1970. But to address your question, the legacy of having that emotional involvement with particular individuals, and of course Mandela was in prison, it was forbidden to even show his face, it left me with a desire, even if I wasn't on the scene, to continue to pay tribute to the principles that were being struggled for. And yes, I actually wrote a poem about the killing of Richard Turner, but I gradually moved towards visual art because I wanted a greater physicality in my tribute. And I wanted to be returned to a face-to-face encounter with these figures like Mandela or Albertina Sisulu or Steve Biko and Oliver Tambo and all of those South Africans who had struggled, but also to pay tribute to the American history of civil rights struggle going back to abolition and Frederick Douglass. So I began to make these portraits. Maybe, Chad, we can just put up one of Mandela just so that there's something instead of my face on the screen. And speak, or of Stephen Biko for that matter. And there's Albertina Sisulu. You can hold it there for the moment. But I'm using, it's a way of communicating an affective, not just an effective relation to persons. And I think in politics, obviously there's tremendous importance in strategy and calculation and abstract principles, but I'm very much, as an artist, wanting to keep the beating heart of what moves people to the fore, and to feel a kind of intimacy and to have these faces really in our presence. So these are various depictions in an embedded set of matrices of cloth, fabric, texture, and that's Albertina Sisulu, often referred to as the mother of the nation. Her husband is on the side, on the bottom right-hand side. I want to stress the importance of women, and I know Monica has been so foundational in this, forming the Women's Coalition and paying tribute and mobilizing what is in fact an often overlooked force. We see it now in Iran or in Afghanistan or in places where the role of women is so fundamental, and I wanted to pay tribute to her here. And yes, there's a raised fist and a live ANC up in the top right-hand corner, but the collage was a way of integrating what had otherwise for me been fragmented, and of healing my own sense of disconnection from these histories, these people, and bringing them and having them be on my walls, and potentially have them be on the walls of the public spaces so that individuals could meet them who hadn't known of them and be moved to inquire, okay, so what was it about her life? What did it mean that she trained as a nurse and had an amazing ability to bring all kinds of people together and organize the first great women's march in 1956, or was put in prison and actually was defended by Mandela back in the 50s. And just extraordinary history. So my motive as an artist was to intrigue people enough to say, I want to learn more about this person if I don't already. And I want to feel a kind of emotional call to that. So, you know, then I find visual ways in which to do that. Is that a tree form at the very bottom with roots that then go into the branches of what becomes a struggle and ends up with a raised fist at the top? Or, you know, just what are these different colors or designs drawing on my own associations? And some of the works have a lot of old handmade lace or very intimate fabrics, whether it's Irish linen or, you know, material. Well, this is the top of it. This is a detail from a portrait of Bernadette Devlin. And so I had picked up pieces of Irish lace while I was in Ireland and wanted to incorporate that. This is a detail, so you don't really see her, although you do see the top right-hand corner has some bars, black and white, which is a feature of a number of these portraits. And there's the one at large. But I wanted to have a tangible textual sense of, I can get my fingers and I can be moved by that on a tactile level. And I think that politics requires that kind of intimacy, particularly in the field of trying to heal and repair and renew. And so that these figures are not just going to remain somewhere back in history on the page or in words, but maybe they can be brought as people that we can visualize and still feel their force. And as you go in close on that, there's bits of button, there's bits of burned fabric, because there's a lot of distress involved and a lot of violence behind these. But my overall hope was that there was the right tension between endurance on the one hand and distress or suffering on the other. And so a number of the other images, if we were to go through them, would have things in common. Even pieces of cloth used for a Mandela portrait will show up in a portrait of Rosa Luxemburg, for example. But there's Mandela, and there again are the bars. I want to say that there's little pieces of material that are drawn from my own clothing, even a shirt of my father's that I saved, who died just in the year after Mandela was released. And I must say, when I met Mandela myself and shook his hand, I had the emotional resonance that I hadn't felt since I'd shaken my father's hand. And so there's just, I want to pay tribute to the emotional side of what is political and the affective side, and to feel a kind of tenderness. But also, Tim spoke of renewal, and I wanted these faces to constantly emerge, as if they were just coming out of a window or looking at us from inside there, again and again, and leading us forward, not just being a harking back to the past. So I'll stop at that moment, although, Chad, you could scroll through a few other images, and I'm happy to speak about it. There's Oliver Tambo. That's Richard Turner, whom I referred to. That's Rosa Luxemburg. Her letters written from prison, I think, are extraordinary documents for us all. And we might come to this later in the program, in which I would like to say, and you can, if you went in close, but you can't, you'd see this handwriting where I've written behind the bars excerpts from her letters that stress the importance of not being degraded to a one or two-dimensional person, but to retain your capacity for happiness and joy and celebration, and understand why it is that you might struggle. And she was, of course, an extraordinary heroic martyr who was assassinated. And had she lived and had she won her struggle, we wouldn't have had the Nazi regime. So we can keep going, but there's Ruth First, another extraordinary, in this case, white South African, who was also assassinated while she was in exile in Mozambique, in Maputo. And so one after another, I just wanted to do justice to can we go back to that one for a moment? Because that's another one of Ruth First. You see the bars of the prison, but she's only partially in there. And then at the very top is the flag of the ANC. And so that these, I'm using colors to stress emotionality, but also forms to suggest growth or floral patterns or hope. And so it goes, but I better stop because I know how little time there is and we want to have more conversation. You can keep scrolling, but I'll stop for there. I think we should end on Nasreen.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I noticed the next image was of Seamus Heaney, who Monica knew, and I think speaking not only about the peace process in Northern Ireland, but about that moment when hope and history rhyme. And such a powerful, capture of not only what happened in Northern Ireland and South Africa, and speaks to your point about imagination and hope. I wanted to ask just Monica, before we go to Q&A, Peter, as a visual artist, is expressing not only something that's universal, but his own lived experience. And it's very much connected to what you and Roelf have experienced and have had to share today. But if there's one place that reminds me of the power of symbols, it's Northern Ireland, both as possessing the ability to bring people together, to maybe literally weave a new identity and narrative, but also can be diminishing and can really move people apart and tear people apart. And as we come up on the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, and the continued work you are engaged in Northern Ireland, how do you think, in terms of the lessons of the role of these symbols as markers of identity, that can play a constructive part or a destructive part to creating this notion of a shared community?
We're a long way from that. Well, we haven't even agreed a narrative. I remember Mandela saying to us when he brought us to South, when you were involved also in bringing us to South Africa, and he said, I don't know how you're going to get to resolve your problem when you haven't even agreed your problem. Because we had conflicting narratives. And I'm not sure, Tim, that we actually have an agreed narrative. Even now, I'm very taken by Roelf saying that there was a shift in the paradigm. I think our mistake was that we had a clash of interpretations about our paradigm. I'm not sure that we shifted it the way that you did. And some people say that perhaps we've managed the conflict in the sense that we stopped the violence. But you've just raised this issue of how we fight each other through emblems and flags and cultural symbols. And in other conflicts where I've been, it's actually those things. It's not always the big things. It's those small things that drive people to be so oppositional and adversarial. I loved Peter's work. And, I just wish that our parliament was covered in those images and Peter got to talk about them. But actually, Peter, you'll take some heart from the fact that last year was the 100th year of the partition of the island. And there was an awful lot of discussion about how we could symbolize that. Some people saw the partition as a tragedy and others saw it as something to celebrate or commemorate, even those words. And I pay tribute to the people, the artists who worked hard to turn over Parliament buildings to a set of portraits that I never thought in my lifetime I would see hanging in Parliament buildings. They were the leaders of the 1916 War of Independence, along with those who opposed any unification. They're all famous figures here. And it would be great to think that an artist like you could come along and explain the roles that they played. I love the words that you talk about, emotional resonance, most particularly being moved to inquire. Yes. Those are powerful words. And, we don't know much about some of the roles of the people that you put up. And I'm worked all my life on violence against women and girls and have seen a lot of changes, but a great deal of the awareness came through poetry, through soap operas, through films, through novelists, through artists, more than anything I could have ever done as a legislator or a policymaker. And it has been through those words, being moved to inquire. So that's what artists do. It's what Seamus Heaney did. And I quote him in my book. I knew him very well. And when a neighbor of mine was killed very tragically, Seamus wrote a poem, and the poems are famous. And it's in Station Island. And
Oh, I know it well. Is this for column?
And my neighbor was William Strathern, a chemist, who answered a door to people who were playing for aspirin for a child, and it was a ruse. They shot him. And so he wrote because he knew the individual, and he described them, the assassinated individuals, who was shocking. There was an element of collusion with the system involved. And he described them, the man who was murdered, who was the brother of my neighbor, as big-limbed, decent, open-faced, the perfect, clean, unthinkable victim. And then he wrote something that pulled me up short, because knowing Seamus, I knew him not to be coarse in his language. But he has the narrator, the ghost, appears in the poem and calls out the unmasked gunmen who shot William Strathern. And he describes them as shites, thinking they were the be-all and the end-all. And I find those words very powerful, in that there's not a much emotional resonance with people who think they are the be-all and the end-all. And Roelf, no doubt, has connected us with people who thought like that in South Africa, that thought they were superior. They thought they were the be-all and the end-all. And probably, Tim, you've got neighbors and people in the United States at the minute who think they're the be-all and the end-all. And you've got very antagonistic adversarial politics in the last couple of years that have really exposed what Peter has been talking about here. And it's the opposite of what Peter said. Politics requires a kind of intimacy. And I don't see much intimacy when I look at the politicians who refuse to cross the aisles and have a dialogue about how to resolve not just the issue of racism in the United States, but some of the other burning issues where they more easily prefer to make people their enemy. So that's the connection. I don't know if I've answered your question. I've probably gone around it, but that's what Seamus Heaney was trying to do here. And I think more than anything, our poets here really created a new narrative for us. We, yes, the politicians, and I include myself in that, we're nowhere near being able to reach an agreed narrative.
Can I just jump in one thing just to say, Monica, I'm very moved by what you said. And I should just go on record as saying I have done several of the 1916 uprising with the faces of MacDonagh and McBride and Connolly and Peirce and Con Markovich and all of those people. And Seamus was a good friend. And so the role of the poet and the resonance of the Irish background is very strong in this.
Actually, it just reminded me, Monica, that you and Peter actually met on Martha's Vineyard in the mid-90s on one of those visits. I think it was in 96 or 97. Well, yeah, we're coming towards the bewitching hour, and I would hate to end this, but I do want to open up for some questions. And I see in the Q&A, and the first question, I guess, goes to you, Roelf, but also to you, Monica. And the question is, what is involved in a paradigm shift? What makes it? And, what if there are no little Mandelas? And I think it's actually for the two of you, but maybe Roelf, start with you since you first stated this.
Well, two sides to it, the one is the personal angle. And sometimes, in my own experience, it was little things that caught my attention that made me believe or understand that this is a path that we couldn't continue. We couldn't stay on the apartheid system. That struck my mind, and there are a number of such little incidents that I can recall over a period of time that had a major impact on me. And I think what I would like to emphasize is, I think at the personal level, one has to develop an awareness. I was recently in Palestine and Israel, and just by walking around there and becoming aware of the tension that is developing there, it is almost like it created with me a feeling, I want to be here to help, to find a way forward. I don't know what is the way forward, but you know, that is the awareness that came to my mind. So that is the one side, the personal effect of things that influence your thinking and contribute to that shift. At the broader level, when we talk about a national conviction that has to be changed, it was that moment of the breakdown in the negotiations that called for a solution, fortunately. So the breakdown was actually the tool that helped us to move out of the previous paradigm and look for a new paradigm. And that was the shift. We were lucky that there was such a moment. But it goes back to also what we've said so many times, and that is in the history and in the development of nations, there are moments of what one can call a window of opportunity. And we had such a moment in our own making of the solution and our creation of the solution. And that shift happened because of the breakdown of the negotiations.
Thank you, Roelf. I don't know if Monica, if you wanted to add anything, but Peter, there was a question for you. What struggles feel most urgent to you now? And are there any struggles you feel uncomfortable speaking or creating works about?
I'll address the first part of that, because indeed I've been making portraits of, I mentioned Nasrin Sotoudeh, the extraordinarily heroic human rights lawyer in Iran. There will be a documentary, Ganit has come back on, she'll give the information, but she's been in prison. She was sentenced to 38 years, has been on hunger strikes, out on medical furloughs, back in prison, horribly oppressed. So I've done several portraits of her, and I'm thinking of that struggle of the Iranian women and now men for freedom, for justice. And I have a portrait of Navalny because I'm obviously obsessed with his incarceration and how much Putin has become a kind of psychotic reiteration of Stalin. And so that's a struggle which I think there's so many people behind each face. There's 1,000 faces of those unknown resistors who I would love to represent as well. But there's struggles all over the world. There's dissidents, Chinese faces, there's Korean faces, there's all kinds of struggles. And I think one wants to see what the universal face of resistance might be. What is that human face of resistance? And so I better stop because I say we've gone over 2 o'clock, but there aren't any that come to mind. I mean, I have First Peoples of this country whose land was taken away and who were submitted to genocide, and figures who were in the resistance amongst them. So I think, you know, from here to Brazil, I have images, and I think we need to see those faces and feel the presence of those people caught up in history.
Can I, before I turn it over to our closing colleague Ganit, to say 2 quick things. When I was in Belfast recently with Monica this August, and I don't think I had a chance to share this with you, Monica, but I happened to meet a cab driver and then a doorman at my hotel. One was from a Protestant loyalist tradition, the other was from a Catholic Republican tradition. And I asked them, so 25 years after the Good Friday Agreement, looking back, what do you feel? And they both said that in many ways, they often feel embarrassed and ashamed by the things they thought, did, supported 25, 35 years ago. That had they had the ability then to look to what happened when conflict deepened, when we didn't get to know each other, when we continued to imagine the worst of each other. Not to say there wasn't profound differences, but that we had more in common, and the only ability to get things done was by understanding each other. They said, I just wish we had the ability then to look in the crystal ball. And it struck me that Roelf recently said to a group of Americans that there are many things when he looks back in his career that he's ashamed and embarrassed by that he said. And the reason I point this out is because at this moment, to your point, Monica, that we're in the United States right now, is there any way, even though we don't have a crystal ball, for Americans who are caught up in this moment on any side and really thinking the worst, doing the worst, and supporting the worst in a sense, of where they can project themselves, their families, and their communities 25 years out? Because there are a few people who, if they could see what happens when things really go off the rail, would ever want to stay where they are today in their emotions and their anger. And
yeah, I mean, I'm quite moved by what the taxi drivers say. Normally, they used to say the taxi drivers had all the solutions to every problem in Northern Ireland, as they do in any country. It's one of the reasons why I had to stop getting into them, because every one of them had a different variety of how I should work and solve the problems here. But that was nice of them to say if they'd had a crystal ball. And I want to take that crystal ball, because Peter in many ways has provided us with a bit of crystal ball by looking back and saying that we can learn from those wonderful human rights defenders. But Roelf too, in that, talks about his own personal change. None of us comes through this, and I certainly didn't come through it without changing myself. And I had to change a lot in terms of, and I learned how to change by talking to my opposite number at the table, David Irvine, who you came to his funeral. Again, a great tribute to you, Tim, that you crossed the Atlantic to pay tribute to a wonderful man. And I say he was wonderful because he challenged his own side, which is what Roelf has done in South Africa. It's easy to challenge the opposition. It's very difficult to challenge your own side. And that's a real sign of bravery. And I think that that's what people are going to have to do in the United States. And I'm just looking at, when we talked about what's happening in Iran, and there's a poem that I start with in one of my chapters, because I was the Chief Commissioner for Human Rights here and had to draft the Bill of Rights, which remains unresolved, even with Brexit. And I started it with a Bani Atman Persian 13th century translation of a poem. If one member is afflicted with pain, other members uneasy will remain. And I think that goes for the United States. It goes for Palestine and Israel at the moment, because I also am still involved there, and it is tragic. But here's my final word, because Roelf wondered what he could do. And I asked myself that too, as I travel to conflict regions. But I have seen wonderful changes from Colombia through to South Africa, and even our own situation, where we celebrate in some ways our 25 years of peace, and we'll still be peace building. That's what I would like to leave, is this hope that we once were described as intractable problems, where people threw their arms up and said, oh, there's no hope there. Oh, we should give up on them. They've been at it forever. They're still fighting about who was here first or who caused the problem. We've got beyond that. And so maybe, a little place like us here, where I speak to you from Belfast, or Roelf from South Africa, or Peter in the great work that he's done. And you too, Tim, can celebrate your 30 years and show the hope that was brought to people when they were in despair. And so I'll finish with that, just to commend you once again for you have lived by the title of the project and programs that you're running. And one of the things you're focusing on now is the psychology of not just, I worked on substance and on issues and what we needed to do to reach a deal. But I learned that the chemistry, the personal chemistry, the psychology, the relationships between us as people who were going to have to share this place together was just as important. And that's what I now know you're focusing on. And maybe that's what you can bring to your own context in the United States. So I'll finish with that you have brought us hope. You helped us through that process. It's unfinished. And I'll leave you that task to resolve the United States politics.
Thank you, Monica, so much. Thank you, my friends. And over to you, Ganit.
Thank you, all of you. I mean, Monica, Peter, Rolf, and of course, Tim, such a pleasure to hear from you. I want to say that the role of art that the Rose Art Museum is standing behind in all these conflicts is very important. And as we saw in Peter's work, another feature of the exhibition, which I wish you could come and see, is that the resistors, just like Monica and Rolf, have been influenced by each other. So you have the South Africans who were influenced by the civil rights leaders. You have a Chinese dissenter who writes that he's like Kafka, and then you have Kafka. I mean, the relationships between these webs and networks are astounding and actually amplify the work and give hope in many, many ways. So this is the second and final program where we, the Rose Art Museum and Beyond Conflict, partnered together. But we also have a program titled Resistance on Film. And we had an exhibition, we had a screening of Navalny. And this Sunday, we have a film, the documentary Nasreen, about the life and struggles of the Iranian human rights lawyer and political prisoner Nasreen Sotoudeh, whose portrait is hanging at the Rose. Beautiful portrait that you made. The screening will be followed by comments from the directors and producers, Jeff Kaufman and Marcia Ross, and will be also in conjunction with the events in Iran. Women, life, freedom is a slogan that, you know, who knew that Peter's exhibition would be so timely, so relevant, and so needed. So I'm eternally grateful to you, our wonderful panelists, and to the audience for being with us. I hope you can join our next programs, and farewell from the Rose Art Museum.